Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this weekly study. I just pray it's a blessing to you. We are in Judges chapter 10, and as you can see on the screen, we have the map showing us where we're at again. Chapter 10 is kind of a interesting little chapter because it takes us in between some of the major judges that we are familiar with and exposes us to a couple people that we maybe had never heard of before. So if you can see my cursor, I'm circling around a little area called Shamir, and the judge's name is Tola. And then he's in chapter 10, and then right above him to the right is a judge named Yair. Um, Transliterating or translated into English, it will have a J, but in Hebrew there is no J sound. It is a Y sound. And so that's just one of those little nuances. If you hear somebody pronounce a name that you may have known more familiarity with a J beginning, and they pronounce it with a Y, it's still really the same name, just with a little bit more of a Hebrew understanding. So we get to Judges chapter 10, and there's after Abimelech there rose to defend Israel Tola, the son of Puah, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he dwelt in Shamir and Mount Ephraim. And line 2 sums up his whole life of 23 years that he died and was buried. Um, it's really kind of sad if you think of it. Here was a guy, he made it into the Bible, his name's there, and then we get some of these really fun sounding names that are just too much fun to pass by. So, how do you pass by Dodo and Pua and Tola? So, fortunately, with the tools that we have, we can go to BibleHub.com and go into the interlinear Hebrew, and it allows us just to take a look at the richness of the Hebrew. And so we're looking at verse 1 of chapter 10 here. And of course, you see the name Tola. There's a hyperlink above it, number 8439. And if you hold your cursor over it, it will pop up it's kind of a brief, they call it a lexicon. It's kind of another word for a dictionary. And you'll see that Tola means a worm. Well, how fun is that? Who would name his kid Worm? And then we look at his dad, whose name is Pua, and his name is Splendid. Okay, so you got a guy whose name is Splendid having a kid that he names Worm. And then his grandpa is the dodo. Well, of course, what it means in Hebrew is different than what we sometimes think of when we hear that word in English and get a little laugh out of it. But the word dodo in Hebrew comes from the word dodi, and it's actually the root word for the name of David or David, and it means to be beloved. In fact, you may know some young ladies or some women that are named or nicknamed Dodi. That is an offshoot of here, and it means beloved. So you have a grandpa named Beloved, has a son named Splendid, who has a son named Worm. Um, again, you can't read into these, you don't quite know what the meaning is, but there's a reason that these names were given. Why would someone name their kid Worm? We just don't know. But what we do know is that he lived for 23 years and did nothing that was outstanding. And maybe that gives you a little bit of insight into that he was pretty much there, but not there. You saw him, but you didn't see him. Maybe he was somewhat invisible, the way, worms are underfoot, and we don't really think anything of it. So could it be that, he was just a guy that was there? He obviously held the piece together because in 23 years, nothing bad happened, but nothing good happened either. His life was just um, nondescript. And again, you could build a lot of thought patterns on a life that's nondescript. And there's a poem called Between the Dash, and it has reference to a tombstone where it has your birth year and your death year, and there's a dash in between. And the whole poem is built upon what happens in the dash and why your tombstone records all of your life in the form of a dash. Well, maybe this is the dash for Abimelech here. I'm sorry, for Tola, that he died. And then, of course, you get to verse 3, and after him rose Yair, a Gileadite, and he judged Israel 22 years. Well, he was a little bit more, had a little bit more going for him here that you look at what he's noted for, and I don't know whether it's worth more to be noted like Tola was with just saying that he lived 23 years or judged 23 years, or you get to this guy named Yair and you look at verse 4 and it lists that he had 30 sons. I mean, whoa, that's just incredible to think of. Um, it shows he was very prolific. He really had a judgeship, if you will, that he took it for all it was worth, is what I'm guessing. He had 30 sons. They rode on 30 donkeys, and they had 30 cities. Um, and this was all that he was noted for. His sons, what can we read into that? We look at the word Yair, again, looking at the fun of the Hebrew here. And so we get to Yair, and his name means he is enlightened. So maybe he saw his predecessor before him who really didn't do much of anything. And Yair says, well, I'm learning from this guy. I'm not going to repeat his mistakes. I'm not going to repeat his life. I'm going to go for all I can go for. And that's what I read into this, because what significance would having 30 sons be, other than it kind of leaves me an indication that he was selfish, that he was living for the pleasure of life, because to have 30 sons, I don't want to speculate on how many wives or women bore these 30 sons to him. And of course, it doesn't list any daughters, just the sign of the times there that they were not listed, but we can probably speculate that there had to be some daughters in there somewhere. And so this guy was really trying to set up his own dynasty, if you will, based upon his lineage. And things must have been somewhat civilized here. Because there's nothing else that really happened. What's interesting looking at is the name of the towns. Now, this word for town is kind of interesting because it is called Yair Havoth. Remember, Yair is his name, and Havoth, this really means that they were villages, but really giving more to that they were tent cities. So when we look at that it says that they had 30 cities, we cannot think that these were, big fortresses and castles on a hillside. They were more of Bedouin type nomadic tent cities, if you will. But basically, they had families, they had people that followed them, and they were very prolific in that they had to separate themselves and go to different areas so that their crops would support their um, animals, and they separated themselves. And again, I don't know that I'd be too proud of this epithet that he was given here in verse 5. He died and was buried. But for these years, for 45 years, the 23 of Atola and the 22 of Yair, they held up the civilization. They kept the people pretty much stable. It doesn't say that they were doing bad things, that they were worshiping idols. There were no wars. You could say it was a pretty nice time to live, that there was nothing that upset the status quo. It would have been a very peaceful time, but yet nothing happened and nothing was recorded in these first 5 verses. But you see, once Yair passed away, where do the children of Israel go? They again do evil. They go downward, and they lose their relationship with God. What's interesting here is the number of gods that are mentioned, false gods, of course, with a little g, that the children of Israel went and went after. There's Baalim, Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Zidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the children of Ammon, the gods of the Philistines. I mean, there's like seven different idols that they went here. It's almost like they had a spiritual religious explosion, that everybody just went, Yair's dead, you know, this whatever confinement of civilization they were living under that kept them serving the one true God. It was like they just threw all caution to the wind and they exploded, kind of like teenagers who finally, turn 18 and can break out of a house, where they've been living if the rules were too strict. And that's the vision I get here, that they just went berserk because they didn't just serve one God. They just blew up and served all these different seven gods in a really, really bad way. And of course, verse 7 tells us what the whole implication of this was, that the Lord was hot against Israel. Again, want to look at the Hebrew in verse 7 because trying to get an understanding of what God's emotion was. We have many instances in the Bible where it shows that God was angry. We've had some studies where I tried to show you that maybe the anger as we have it translated into English was not in the same mindset that we are caused to understand, of just being irrational, throwing pots and pans around, just doing things that are off the handle, and in a very negative, irrational way, the way we as people do today. And so when we look at verse 7, we see the word vayichar, which translated is to become kindled. Something starts churning inside of you. There's a heat. It calls it to be hot with vexation inside. And then the word 639, which is off, is the word for nostril or face. I think many of you remember when I've talked about that he was feeling vexation inside to where his nostrils would flare, where his nose would turn red. But remember, God is spirit, so God doesn't have a nose. God doesn't have a body part that would show these, but it's to give us an understanding of how he was feeling. Notice that in Hebrew it uses the word Yahweh um, for the name of the Lord here, which is his compassionate, merciful side. Again, how do you connect that together with the vexation and the what he's feeling inside connected to his merciful side? And that's where, we can get a little bit better insight into the emotion that God was feeling of betrayal. And that becomes even a little bit more clear when we get to what's happening here, that in verse 8, they God sends, well, I'm sorry, in verse 7, it says he sold them into the hands of the Philistines. That word sold is kind of interesting because it has an understanding to the same way of a marriage. It's used in a way that marriages used to be arranged back in that time, and there was a bride dowry that was paid and an exchange that was made. So what God is feeling here is a betrayal of love, a betrayal of commitment, a betrayal of the trust and the faithfulness is the word I'm looking for, a betrayal of the faithfulness that he had in what he's viewing as a marriage relationship with Israel. And so he takes them and somewhat remarries them, or allows them to be remarried into the hands of the Philistines. So because you can't sell a people per se, at least the way we understand it. And so the roots of this word here is that the marriage contract was passed off to these other foreign gods because God's heart was so broken, and the relationship was so crushed in his heart that he just is saying, okay, if you want to be married to these other gods and have a deep relationship with them, I'm going to let you do it. And that's really the emphasis of this verse 7. And it says, of course, that when he sold them or allowed them to go in the way their heart was taking them away from God, they were vexed and they were oppressed, basically feeling the same emotion that God was feeling as they were unfaithful to Him. And we see that the Israelites, felt this oppression. What strikes me as strange is it took 18 years for them to finally get the picture. I would love to have got a better understanding of how that happened. How long did it take for them before they finally woke up? Year 15, 16, you'd think somebody would start getting the picture after year two, you know? Why did it take 18 years for them to wake up? Um, Again, I wish I had a better understanding, but they eventually did. You'll see that in the Book of Judges. It is a Six Flags Great America roller coaster ride of up and down in their relationship with God. They were up in the beginning of the chapter, now they're plunging down, and they reach a point in verse 10 where they say, "We have sinned against you um, because we have forsaken God and served these other ones." And the Lord spoke to them, and of course, you wonder, how did the Lord speak? We assume there's only really two choices, either a voice thundered from heaven or he had a prophet come and speak to them. There's no indication that there were prophets. We know the tabernacle was still there. This had to be going on, that the priests and the prophets were still meeting there and still serving God in their, traditional way that was pleasing to God, but as a whole, the society of the Israelites had gone the opposite direction. And so a prophet, I assume, came to the children of Israel, spoke on the behalf of God this message saying, did I not deliver you from the Egyptians, the Amorites, the children of Ammon, and the Philistines, and all these other ones, the Ziotians, Amalekites, Maonites? They oppressed you, and then you cried out to me, and I delivered you. But he says, I'm done. Basically, he says, verse 18, you have forsaken me and served other gods. I'm not going to deliver you anymore. You have not learned. And this is really a challenging verse. It's disheartening for us as we serve God and know that we make mistakes, know that we stumble and fall, and see that God does seem to have a breaking point. God does seem to have a line that can be crossed, if you will. And again, this is Old Testament. We want to think New Testament that God's grace is greater and He's more forgiving. Um, I want to think that. I choose to think that. But then if I want to be totally open and make sure I take all scriptures as they're given to us, this is something to think about. This is something to think that, is there a place where we can push God away so far that He doesn't interact with us anymore? I think we'll find that in the New Testament there are indications of that also, that people can walk away from God and God will not reach out to them anymore. So he even kind of taunts them in verse 14. I don't look at it as a taunt. I look at it as more that his heart is so broken that he is just so filled with emotion and heartbreak that he says, "Go and cry unto the other gods that you have chosen. Let them deliver you." And the children of Israel said, "Oh, we've sinned. Don't let them punish us. Do whatever you think is good unto us," which is quite a strange request, but it shows that they are understanding that even God at his, we'll use the word worst of punishment, is still better than any punishment they would get from people who are serving idols and not involved with God. And so they're appealing to God, saying, "Give us whatever you want to give us because we trust your mercies unto us more than these enemies that are around about us." And so they went ahead on their own with no promise, with no assurance that God was going to deliver them or do anything. In fact, quite the contrary. But they went ahead on verse 16 and said they put away the strange gods from them. They served the Lord, and it says that God's soul grieved for the misery of Israel. So even though He said He wasn't going to deliver them anymore, we see that God has a heart, soul, again, hard to wrap our understanding around as to what emotion this could be describing in God, who is a spirit being, but he so loved Israel that he was grieved for what they were going through. And chapter closes out just saying what the children of Ammon did, and that it looks like a war is coming on here, and the Israelites want to break free, but God's not leading them. Who's going to help them? Will God change his mind? Will they be overwhelmed? We don't know because the chapter ends. And so we'll have to come back next week and take a look at chapter 11 and see what God permits here, or does he intervene? So thanks so much for joining us. Pray that you're blessed by this and have a wonderful week, and see you next week. Bye-bye.